Should a biblical worldview shape the way that we teach every academic subject? That question has been debated by Christian educators for decades, and nowhere more intensely than in the science classroom. The purpose of this series is to provide tools and a framework, a way of thinking, so that you are best equipped to immerse your students in a biblical worldview as it applies to the science classroom. Now, in this video, I actually want to begin by sharing my first real exposure to how a teacher's worldview does, in fact, influence the way that they teach science. And in my story, this was a situation where it wasn't somebody who had a biblical worldview that was influencing the way that they were teaching science. Rather, this was a professor in a university teaching anatomy. And it was in that class where I saw how a secular, naturalistic worldview influenced the way that he taught anatomy. And it was in my anatomy class where I had my first experience of the relationship between worldview and science education. So I want to share that story to give you an illustration for what it might look like to bring a biblical worldview into the science classroom. But to begin, it might be helpful for me to give you some context on my own worldview journey. When I was in high school, I did not think too much about God. It was not an interesting question to me. And there are various reasons for that, but it was just not a topic that was on my radar. If you would have pressed me at the time, what is my worldview? I didn't have too much thinking about that. But as I reflect back on the time when I was in high school, my worldview was probably influenced mostly by the TV series Star Trek. When I was really little, I remember watching Star Trek with my dad. And that was a TV show that just captivated my attention. I remember thinking about what it would be like in the future when we can travel space or when technology develops to the point where we can be beamed from one place to another place. And even though I didn't put a lot of thought into it, that TV show shaped the way that I thought about science, about progress, and about religion. And it wasn't a conscious thing so much as it was an unconscious thing, because I just had this mindset that someday science will eventually replace religion. Science is what progresses humanity, religion is what holds us back. And I think when it comes to worldview thinking at all, this is just a good illustration how worldviews are often caught more than they are taught. But of course, there does come a point in life where you do start to think deeply about the things that you believe, why that you believe them. And for me, my first recollection of when I started thinking deeply about worldview, now I didn't use the word worldview, it's just when I started thinking more deeply about life, was my senior year of high school. I took a philosophy class that our high school offered called the Theory of Knowledge. And it was in that class where I was exposed to ideas that I had just never thought about deeply before. And one of those ideas was thinking about God. So, like I said, uh, most of high school, God wasn't even on the radar. But in this theory of knowledge class, we had a unit where we talked about reasons for people that people have given throughout history for believing in God, and also reasons for why people don't believe in God. And I remember being introduced to a philosopher named Bertrand Russell, where he had this. We read a short article in class where he basically argued that believing in God is no different than believing in Santa Claus. When you're little, you believe in Santa Claus because you're young. You trust your parents. You want presents to be under the tree. And so you think if I believe and I'm a good boy, Santa's going to be bringing me presents. But when you get older, you just kind of grow out of those childish beliefs. And in the article that I read by Bertrand Russell, he argued that belief in God is like that. It's kind of like believing in a teapot orbiting around the sun. So if somebody were to come up to you and to ask you the question, do you think that there's a teapot orbiting around the sun? Most people would say, no, that's silly. But if this person was like, well, let me tell you the good news. There is a teapot orbiting around the sun. And if you believe that, you're going to be rewarded. Most people would have a very difficult time believing that because there's just no evidence for a teapot orbiting around the sun. But now, if this person was insistent and said, well, you just have to have faith that there's a teapot orbiting around the sun, eventually you would get impatient and you would say, look, I can't have faith in that. And if they push back and they say, well, what's your evidence that there is no teapot orbiting around the sun? What Russell says with this illustration is you come to a point where you realize that believers are the ones that have the burden of proof. Somebody who doesn't believe in a teapot orbiting around the sun doesn't have to prove that that teapot doesn't exist. That's to get the burden of proof wrong. The person who says, no, there is a teapot orbiting around the sun, the person making that claim, the believer in that claim, is the one who has the burden of proof. They're the ones that needs to demonstrate that there is uh, reasons for believing in this teapot. And in the same way, he says, that is what we should believe about religion. Uh, there is no good reason to believe that God exists, according to Russell. And until somebody provides evidence, the person lacking belief is the one who has the more reasonable claim. And I remember learning that in high school, and that idea just made so much sense to me. I later got into Russell, and Russell's ideas. Now, I shouldn't state more than I want to at this point. I wasn't a deep philosopher when I was in high school, but this topic was really interesting to me. And I remember reading an article by Bertrand Russell called A Free Man's Worship. And in this article, Russell writes this. He says, man is the product of causes which had no provision of the ends they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves, and his beliefs are nothing but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. Now, when I was in high school, this idea just made sense. And remember, I watched a lot of Star Trek. That was the worldview that was promoted by Star Trek. We are just nothing but the accidental collocation of atoms. And when we embrace that, when we embrace science, the science of atoms, we will learn to progress humanity to a better place than we're in right now. So that's where my worldview journey started in high school. When I started thinking deeply about life, about religion, about God, I was not a believer. And in fact, I would have debates with some of my Christian friends about why I didn't think there was any good reason to believe in God. And then one day, one of those friends invited me to a Christian music festival. Now I don't know why I went to this Christian music festival other than it was a chance to hang out with friends. I didn't know anything about Christian music, but I went to this music festival, and for the entire day, I was just there for a day. I started to experience conversations, discussions that were just completely new to me. And one of those discussions was about having a personal relationship with Jesus. I met people who claimed to have a personal relationship with Jesus, and none of that made any sense to me. Jesus was a historical figure that lived 2,000 years ago. How could you have a personal relationship with him? And at the end of the night, there was a band playing called the Newsboys. Again, I knew nothing about Christian music. I knew nothing about the Newsboys. But during their concert, the lead singer explained the gospel and gave an invitation that if anyone at the concert wanted to pray to receive Jesus, they could do it this night. And he invited people to close their eyes and say a prayer. Now, again, I was not religious. I didn't feel comfortable closing my eyes and praying. Instead, I kept my eyes open and I just observed what happened. And after the prayer, he asked if anyone just prayed to receive Christ, would you raise your hand? And I noticed that hundreds of hands went up. And then the lead singer said, if you knew God before coming to the concert tonight, would you raise your hand? And then I saw thousands of hands go up. People started cheering. And that was the first time since I was a kid, a little kid, where I remember actually praying. Again, I don't believe in God. I don't think that, prayer is going to do anything, but I prayed the most honest prayer that I could. And I said, God, I don't think that you're real, but if you are real, you're going to have to make me believe. And after that night, I went home probably about 2, 3 in the morning. And I remember the lead singer of the Newsboys said that if you did pray to receive Christ, the next thing to do is to get a Bible and to start reading. And so even though I didn't pray to receive Christ, I went home and I was curious enough early in the morning to get out a Bible that we had in our house. It was an old pulpit Bible. The one on the screen, this is basically what it looked like. And I've never read the Bible before, didn't know where to begin. So I just opened somewhere to the middle. And by chance, I opened up to this passage in Isaiah 7:9, which says this: And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Rameliah. And if you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. Now, I read this verse, and I can honestly say it did nothing for me. I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't know who the head of Ephraim and Samaria, I didn't know anything. I had no context. But there was a footnote in this verse that I followed down to the bottom. And in that footnote was this quote by Augustine of Hippo, who lived between AD 354, AD 430. And in this quote, Augustine said this: Understanding is the reward of faith. Therefore, seek not to understand that you may believe, but instead believe that you may understand. Now, when I read that quote, there was almost instantly a paradigm shift that happened for me. I don't think that that was the moment that I became a believer, but it was a new way of thinking about faith. It was a new way of thinking about God, of thinking about religion. Because, like I said, I had had some debates with my Christian friends, some friendly debates. And one of the things that I would frequently say to them is, if you give me evidence, I'll believe. I was using Russell's burden of proof. But if you can't give me evidence, then I'm justified in just lacking belief, just not believing, because the person making the claim bears the burden of proof. I never considered the fact that maybe faith comes first and then you get understanding. And it was a paradigm shift. I went to bed that night, and when I woke up in the morning, I went outside and I saw the same trees that I had always seen, but yet I looked at those trees differently. I remember after that day at the Newsboys concert, looking at nature and the world around me, and I just had a perspective. This is clear evidence for God. How could any of this happen by accident? If you have art, there must be an artist. If you have design, there must be a designer. If you have, it was just so clear to me that God must exist. Now, before that day, I looked at the same exact evidence, the same world, the same natural world, the same trees. And my conclusion was there's no evidence for God. Where's God? All I see is trees. And this is a very important key to understanding the nature of worldview. Worldview does not change the data, it changes your perspective on the data. And in that day, that was my first real consideration that there is a God who is in control, who governs everything. So that was the summer before I went to college. Fast forward a couple years, I'm now in college, I'm a sophomore, and I am a young Christian. I believe in God, and I am taking one of the hardest classes at our university. It was a very large class. It was a weed out class that took place in a room that looks just like the one that you see on your screen right now. And the class was anatomy. the professor of that class was a phenomenal professor, very engaging. And one of the things that made him engaging, looking back, is that he would frequently bring worldview into the classroom. Now, it wasn't like he was intentional about it. I don't know if that was an intention of his, but I remember specifically a class where we were learning about the anatomy of the eye. And this professor went up to the blackboard and he drew a diagram that looks like the one that you see on your screen. He drew a very simple eye and then some wires behind the eye, and he wanted to explain how seeing happens. And he said, for seeing to happen, you have to have light come into the eye through the pupil. Once it comes into the eye, he explained that it has to go to the back of the eye to the retina. And when the light gets to the retina, the wires that's behind the eye, this is inside of the retina, the light has to pass through these wires, these ganglion cells and bipolar cells, and eventually the light gets to the photoreceptors, which are the cones and the rods. When the light gets there, that light now transforms into an electrical signal, and that signal goes through all of that wiring, the bipolar cells, the ganglion cells. Eventually, it goes to the optic nerve, which sends a signal to the visual cortex in the back of your brain, and then voila, you start to see. This was all really cool stuff. But after he explained the process that the light travels through, he wrote on the board in quotes, intelligent, sarcastically, intelligent design. And he said any engineer could make a better design than that. Why? Because he said all you have to do is flip around the wires with the photoreceptors and you have a much more intuitive design where the light passes through the pupil to the retina. It hits the photoreceptors without passing through all the wiring, and then the signal is sent straight back to the optic nerve, and any engineer could design this better. And so he writes on the board, intelligent design, any engineer could create a better eye. Now, as I reflect back on that lesson, I asked the question, and I posed the question to you, was this a science lesson or was this a worldview lesson? And the answer I give to that is yes, it's both. And the reason is you cannot teach any lesson without also teaching worldview. If you're teaching on any subject, worldview is always going to come through. It's going to come through in your content. So in this anatomy class, he chose to focus in on the unusual wiring of the human eye. And that was a place that he highlighted. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not critiquing him for doing this. Our worldview shapes what we look at, it shapes what we find interesting, and it shapes what content we decide to highlight. It also shapes our commentary in our teaching. So when he showed the unusual wiring of the eye, he didn't just highlight it, he gave a commentary or an assessment of what we were looking at. And he said any engineer could create a better eye. That comment, that commentary was a theological statement. And the reason this is important to recognize is because we are always teaching worldview. Why? Because we are human. Again, I don't fault my professor for doing this. He's a human being. He has opinions. He has thoughts. He has biases. We all do. We all think. We all wonder. We all think, why is the eye this way? Why is the tree that way? Why are things beautiful? Why are things ugly? We're always wondering. This is a good thing. Now, as Christian educators, our job is to be aware of which worldview we're teaching our students while we're teaching our subject. My college professor was teaching naturalism while he was teaching anatomy. It was science, but it was also worldview, and that's important to recognize. In my next video, what I want to do is I want to talk about this same lesson that I got when I was in college, and then imagine what it might look like to approach that same lesson from a biblical worldview.